Hi there. Um, Welcome to the Divergent Design Studios live stream, YouTube show, and soon to be, I hope, lightly edited podcast. Um, if you're watching this on the replay, check it out. I'll put an announcement in the description below when we do finally get the podcast up and running. But anyway, I'm very excited that you're here. And yeah, it looks like a few of you are already watching, which is fantastic. I'd love to see some comments because, as I always like to say, I don't really believe that it's live until I see some comments from you all. Anyway, hi. Like true confessions here. Yesterday, I thought all day long that it was Tuesday. And so I didn't really prepare this. And so I spent all day today preparing it, which is great. It's all super fresh in my mind, but I do feel a tiny bit frazzled. But I'm going to get over that really fast. Angelo is in the house. How exciting. So glad to see you here, Angelo. Yeah. All right. I think that now that I believe that there's actually somebody out there listening, I'm going to turn away from the comments for a little while, but I will definitely come back to them. And we can have a conversation, which is always like the best part of this live stream. But you're here, I suppose, because of the topic that I'm talking about, which is, can you trust ADHD experts? Recently, I put a question up on Instagram asking people for suggestions for topics that I might address on the live stream. And my good friend Elizabeth Brink suggested, she didn't put it quite that way. That's like my sort of slightly clickbaity algorithm driven title for this live stream. But she was basically saying, how do you know who to trust? How do you know who the experts are? How do you think through the claims that are made? And I just thought that was a fantastic question. And it's right up my alley. Something that I just love to talk about and have been urging people to do pretty much my whole adult life as a teacher and an educator. So anyway, can you trust ADHD experts? And I would say, at least in the first instance, why? No. You shouldn't basically trust people who are making claims until you have established that they are trustworthy. That's my approach. Obviously, you can't do that. I mean, I think that that's true just in general, not just about ADHD. I think in general, when people make claims, you should investigate whether or not those are trustworthy claims and whether their sources are trustworthy sources. And then eventually you can come to trust certain people, certain sources, and you can sort of ease off a little bit on the tips that I'm going to give you for thinking critically about the claims that people make. And again, this is certainly not exclusive to the ADHD industry at all. Pretty much every industry makes claims. And often they are quite dubious claims. And I think that we've become a culture of people who just believes what we're told and we don't think critically about what we're told. And so I'm going to offer some suggestions for how to think critically and some examples from my own experience of so-called experts who have made claims that I feel have been unsubstantiated. I have I'm going to be referring to my notes quite a bit in this live stream, more so than I normally do, because I feel like just as I'm telling you that you shouldn't trust other people's claims unless they're substantiated, I'm going to try to sort of substantiate or at least back up my own arguments. And of course, my iPad is going to keep dying. So I guess what I was saying is that of course, you can't do this in every single area of your life all the time. track down the evidence for every single claim that everybody ever makes. But if you're here and wondering whether or not you can trust the claims of ADHD experts, then you probably already have a little bit of a sort of skeptical perspective on the ADHD industry. And I think that you're right to, because this field is incredibly political and ideological. And I think that it's a good, like in this field, especially because it affects us so deeply, I think it's an especially good place to start being skeptical and asking lots of questions about the claims that experts make. All right. And I also want to say that no expert who is worth their salt should disagree with your right to question and investigate their claims. All right. Including me. I mean, I don't put myself out there as an expert. I try mostly to speak from my own personal experience and the experience of people that I know and love. I speak largely in metaphors, not scientific claims. But to the extent that I do make claims that should be based in science, you should absolutely question them and track down my sources. To the if I make those kinds of claims, I am going to cite sources, and you should track them down. And I guess I would just say that if a so-called expert questions your right to, to question their claims, to track down their sources and validate what they're saying, if they do that, that in and of itself is a huge red flag. And so just as a couple of quick examples, in my own experience, I've done on my Instagram, I've done quite a bit of taking down the claims that are made by a lot of the influencers in the ADHD space, and also on Twitter, and Attitude Magazine, which is a trade journal of the ADHD industry. And as a consequence, both a bunch of like big ADHD Twitter influencers and Attitude Magazine itself have blocked me, have blocked my accounts, which again just says that they are not, I mean, that again, that's just a huge red flag. Anybody who is actually an expert in their field and who is actually making substantial and substantiatable, I don't know if that's a word, claims should welcome your skepticism, should welcome your questions, and should not block you or patronize you or disparage you in any way. All right. So moving right along. Like I said, this is going to keep, I don't know how to make this not go blank. All right. So I'm going to give you 5 tips for thinking critically about the claims that ADHD experts make, along with examples. All right. And the first one is that you can and should cite down citations to support any claims that are made by experts. I don't care what kinds of credentials they have or where they're publishing or what kinds of letters they have after their name. If they make a claim, they should cite their evidence. But here's the thing. I have found, especially in this industry, that often supposedly well-respected experts in the industry will make claims and they will seem to be citing sources. They'll have footnotes, they will have hyperlinks. And I think that for the most part, we just skip over that because we assume that, oh, this is somebody with an MD or a PhD and they have dropped a footnote or they've given me a hyperlink. Like, why would I chase that down? Of course they can be trusted. And the sad truth is that no, actually they can't. So the first example that I want to give you is, and many of you, if you followed me on Instagram and or on my Patreon, already know a little bit about this, but this is the story of Dr. William Dodson. And the syndrome, pathology, I'm not sure what you should even call it, that he invented and coined as rejection sensitive dysphoria, RSD. And you've probably heard of rejection sensitive dysphoria, and you may or may not know that it is an entirely is not a scientific syndrome or recognized in any kind of medical literature or scientific community as an actual thing. But Dr. William Dodson, who has spent his life treating people with ADHD, came up with this term and then began writing about it in Attitude magazine, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, because even just that is a red flag, as I will talk about in a minute. Making all sorts of claims about this syndrome that he had identified in his patients and was calling RSD, or rejection sensitive dysphoria. And one of the claims that he made in Attitude magazine, without any citation at all, was that rejection sensitive dysphoria is not the same thing as trauma, that it's not treatable by traditional therapies that treat trauma, and that it is, in fact, according to him, a neurobiological genetic trait that is intrinsic to ADHD and that is only treatable by a couple of specific medications. And when I first read about RSD, which is something that happens to, I think, a lot of us, it felt really affirming because Lord knows I spent most of my life being really sensitive to rejection. No question about it. Like really reactive, really hyper, sort of aware and alert for it. And so to have somebody name that and associate it with ADHD and tell me that like this was just part of this disorder that I have was actually really comforting. And I think that that's true for a lot of people who have ADHD. And it's one of the reasons that it has so quickly become part of the sort of the vernacular in the ADHD community, and especially in the less critical ADHD community. Like you'll see lots of tweets and posts and conversations about, oh, my RSD is really acting up today. Oh, you know, I'm having a really bad RSD day, those kinds of things. And as I want to be really clear that I'm in the story that I'm about to tell you, that I'm not questioning the suffering that many of us feel on account of sensitivity to rejection. I think that I know from vast personal experience that sensitivity to rejection and reactivity and emotional dysregulation in the face of rejection is all too real and is intense. And yeah, that part is, there's no question, is real. But the more that I started to think about it, the more I started to read about what Dodson was saying about RSD, and especially the more that I started to learn about trauma and complex trauma, and started putting like the symptoms of RSD, according to Dr. Dodson, up against the symptoms of complex trauma, I started to think, what is the likelihood that this really is just that a sensitivity to rejection that looks exactly like complex trauma is not actually complex trauma, but is something that is baked into a particular neurotype. Like it just didn't make any sense to me. And like, that's a good time to start questioning somebody's claims, when they just don't make any sense when you start to really think about them. So I started to question whether or not the reality of the sensitivity to rejection and not the suffering of emotional dysregulation. I'm never questioning those things. Those things are real and debilitating and like a really central experience of being a neurodivergent person. But what I started to question was Dr. Dodson's theory about the origins of those experiences, and in particular, his insistence that this sort of emotional dysregulation and sensitivity to rejection cannot be treated through any sorts of therapies other than 2 specific medications used off-brand. So I started to wonder about all that, and I noted that in his Attitude magazine article, there weren't any citations for this really strong scientific claim that he was making. So I wrote to him. I sent him an email. I didn't realize this. He had just retired, but he had a clinic, an ADHD clinic that still had a website, and there was still like a contact form. So I just sent through that contact form a message to him just saying, you said this in this Attitude magazine, and I just cited what his claim was. And I said, could you please send me the citations from the scientific literature that support that claim? That's all I said. And I didn't hear back from him for a long time. And it turned out that the reason was because he had just retired and he wasn't really paying attention to that contact form anymore. But eventually he did actually write me back. I'm very apologetic for the delay and explaining that he had just retired. And I do want to say here that this is not a personal attack on Dr. Dodson. Everything that I know about him as a person and a human, or almost everything that I know about him as a person and a human being, and certainly the way that he wrote back to me in this email, it strikes me he's just a really lovely person who really does care about the suffering of people with ADHD. I'm also suspicious that, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, in this very lengthy response to my brief request, he basically acknowledged that there is no scientific literature to back up that claim. He did that in a sort of roundabout way, saying like, oh, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, those academics, they don't really live in the real world and they're not really researching the things that they ought to be researching. And, he's just a clinician. He's not an academic researcher. And then he told me about his vast experience treating people with ADHD and the anecdotal observation of decades of treating people with ADHD, and cited that he'd only ever seen, maybe I think it was 2 patients who had effectively been able to overcome sensitivity to rejection through traditional talk therapy. And that was his evidence for saying that it must therefore be something that's baked into the ADHD neurotype. He didn't use the term neurotype, but anyway. And then he went on to say that that actually RSD probably is a misnomer, and that what he's really just talking about is emotional dysregulation, emotional reactivity. And then he cited a whole bunch of studies coming out of Europe that he was super excited about, which, when I tracked them down, merely correlate emotional dysregulation to ADHD, which, like, duh, like, I don't actually even need citations for that. Like, we all know, right, that there's a correlation between ADHD and emotional dysregulation. So anyway, but he was really excited about these studies and actually did cite them with hyperlinks and end of, right? But one thing that you need to know, like, you don't need to be a scientist to do this work. You don't need to be a researcher. You don't need to like be schooled in clinical psychology or statistics or anything else. But one thing that you do need to know is that there's a difference between correlation and causation, right? Just because 2 things happen at the same time does not mean that one thing caused the other. So just because people with ADHD often have emotional dysregulation does not mean that ADHD causes emotional dysregulation. Okay, like, that's just a really, like, you probably learned that in your like freshman biology class in high school. Like, that's just like a really basic tenet of the scientific process, right? So Anyway, so then I started on my Instagram really kind of pushing back against this notion that that rejection sensitive dysphoria is an intrinsic and neurological genetic part of the ADHD neurotype. And then I noticed, interestingly, and I think I did actually write him back and ask him to consider the possibility that what he was describing as rejection sensitive dysphoria was in fact complex trauma, which he refused to do. I mean, he didn't respond to my second email. And then what I noticed is that in Attitude magazine, he started publishing again. The article that I had asked him about was quite old. He started publishing again, sort of doubling down on, I don't know if that was in response to me at all. I don't know at all. I know that he was really excited about all this new research coming out of Europe, so it entirely could have been about that. But he didn't respond at all to the suggestion I had made about complex trauma, and instead doubled down on this notion that RSD is not trauma. He wrote a new article in Attitude magazine called New Insights into Rejection Sensitive Dysphoria, where he tones down the claims that he's making a little bit, and then, but still says it's not trauma. He says RSD is not thought to be caused by trauma. And the word trauma is a hyperlink. And this is what I'm talking about, where you have to track these things down, because like on the face of it, you would think that whatever is on the other end of that hyperlink is going to support his claim that RSD is not thought to be caused by trauma, right? And then the link links to another article that's called ADHD and Trauma, Untangling Causes, Symptoms, and Treatments. And then the subhead is How ADHD Causes Trauma. And like the whole article that he's citing as support for his notion is actually, like, I could have written it. It's basically arguing that being ADHD in an NT world causes complex trauma. Like, it just blew my mind, right? And it wasn't that hard to just follow the link. But I think that he sort of assumes that nobody's going to do that, or nobody's going to read the article that he's linking to carefully, or maybe he misread it. Like, it was such complete amateur hour over there at Attitude magazine, which again, I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So, and then this article did cite all that research out of Europe. But again, none of that, if you actually went and looked at it, had anything to do with causation. It was all about correlation. So that's the first tip that I have for you. Track down the sources, read the footnotes, click on the hyperlinks, go, don't just see that the article was published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Actually go look at the abstract and see what it says, because sometimes people will cite articles and they'll cite articles that are in really respected journals that you really can trust, but they don't actually have anything to do with the claim that's being made. Like, the article is probably completely worthy and, well researched and all the rest of it, but it actually has nothing to do with the claim that's being made. Like, that's another one that I see a lot, especially in Attitude magazine. So number 2, if one is track down citations and claims, number 2, question deference and claims of authority. Like, just because Dr. Dodson has an MD, I don't even think he has a PhD. I think he has an MD. But just because he is an authority, and Jess Meadows is saying, also look at the conflict of interest section under studies that are cited. Okay, that's a great addition. I'm going to put that up here, right here. Look at the conflict of, I can move that down, can I? That's nice. The conflict of interest section under studies that are cited. And Jess also says, Also sometimes called financial disclosures, pharma money distorts studies. Yeah, in fact, Jess, unsurprisingly, as is often the case, is ahead of me because I'm going to talk about following the money in just a little bit. But right now, I just want to talk about questioning deference and claims to authority. And I mean, I hate to say this, but in this industry especially, it's just egregious. And I would just want to call out Attitude Magazine in particular, because I believe that what Attitude Magazine does borders on fraud, like on medical fraud or scientific fraud. Because I don't know, I actually haven't looked at Attitude Magazine in well over a year, so maybe they've changed this, though I doubt it. But Attitude Magazine has what it calls a peer review panel that, and if you look at some of the articles, like this one by Dr. Dodson, that make scientific claims, there at least used to be a little line in like, under the headline or something that said, peer reviewed by the Attitude peer review panel on, and there would be a date. And I wondered about that peer review panel. And when you click on it, it just takes you to a list of all of the experts who publish at Attitude Magazine. There's nothing in it about an actual panel, or even or a process by which even individuals are doing peer review. And again, if you're not familiar with scientific literature, you may not know that peer review is a term of art in scientific research. It means a really specific thing. Is part of the sort of validation process of any kind of scientific study that gets published. Like, in the world of scientific research, it's just not really regarded as valid if it hasn't been peer reviewed. So that means something, right? Attitude Magazine is using that term really loosely. And again, I believe in a way that borders on fraud, precisely because it is a term of art in the world of scientific literature. So I started to question and then the other thing I noticed about that peer review tag was that no matter how old the article was, the peer review had always happened like a week before. Like it was a constantly moving target, as though Attitude Magazine was on an ongoing basis peer reviewing its articles. So I just started to think that was kind of fishy. I sent questions to Attitude Magazine about like what was this peer review panel and who was on it and what was the procedure that they went through, and never heard back from Attitude Magazine. And I actually think that was around the time that they decided to block me on Instagram. But again, I don't know if it's in response to my inquiries or not, and my like sort of takedowns on Instagram. But later on, I did notice that they changed the peer reviewed by the peer review panel, or approved by peer review panel, to peer reviewed by, and there was actually a name of somebody who had reviewed this. It was the same article by Dr. Dodson, and her name was Dr. Sharon Saline. So I was like, okay, great. Now there's an actual person that I can talk to. So I found her email. She was a psychologist, I think. I don't remember exactly what, but I think a psychologist in private practice who was associated with Attitude Magazine and published there sometimes. But I tracked her down. I found her email. I sent her a request. Same thing. Could you send me the scientific literature upon which you approved as a peer of Dr. Dodson's his claims that blah, 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 blah. And she got right back to me. But the thing is that I'm going to try to find her. Hold on one second. She got right back to me, and she basically said that Dr. Dodson is a respected expert psychiatrist, author, and speaker in the field of ADHD. And she said it's a relatively new diagnosis, so there's not a lot out there about it. But then she, like, for a whole paragraph, cites Dr. Dodson's own article as evidence that that it's valid and should be accepted under the peer review process. Like, she basically recites back his article to me as though I can't read. And then she goes on to say, for this reason and information gleaned about emotional reactivity among people living with ADHD from these and other sources and books. And then she cites some other so-called experts by Dr. Thomas Brown, Dr. Russell Barkley, and Dr. Edward Hallowell, amongst others. I did not challenge Dr. Dodson's statement. And then she says, and Attitude Magazine just published a follow-up piece on RSD that features 8 footnotes. Perhaps this is just evidence. Anyway, so I was kind of astonished by this reply. Like, this is, again, just like complete amateur hour. I was kind of astonished that she was willing to put her name on that peer review claim, and that she was able, with a straight face, without just incredible embarrassment, to write this email back to me. Because basically what she said was, I don't question Dr. Dodson. He's a well-respected expert. He's got initials after his name. He's done lots of work in this field. And also lots of other people who are also well-respected experts in this field, and have lots of initials after their name, and have also published lots of things, agree with him. And therefore, who am I to challenge them? And as I said in an Instagram post about that, in case you're not familiar with how scholarship works, deference is not a medical review, and assumptions based on one's own anecdotal observation are not qualitative research. So this is just an example of, like, there's a lot of people have a lot invested in the ADHD industry in some of these claims. I personally believe that a lot of it is just a big house of cards, and that they're willing to, like, say really embarrassing things in order to prop that house of cards up. And it was clear that she wasn't taking me seriously at all. But anyway, that's number 2. Deference is not the same as citation. Deference is not the same as peer review. We cannot just accept, that meme that has a picture of Abraham Lincoln and the text underneath says, "Don't believe everything you read on the internet," and then it attributes it to Abraham Lincoln. Like, I just love that. Like, don't believe anything somebody says just because they're an authority, right? All right. I just need to take a breath and take a drink of water. So I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts or questions so far before I move on to number 3. And I do realize there's a lag. So I'm just going to take another drink. This is the stuff that'll get lightly edited out of the podcast, right? All right. Well, I will hop back over to the comments if some come in. I do think that there's quite a lag, so I understand that. The third tip that I have for you when you're trying to think critically about claims that are made, especially within the ADHD industry, and especially in Attitude Magazine, like, really, you cannot take that magazine seriously. It is not a scientific journal. It's not a peer-reviewed journal. What it is, and what would be fine for it to be if they would just admit that this is what it is, it's a trade journal that that sort of lobbies for the ADHD industry. And, trade journals have their place, And as long as you know that they have a really distinct perspective and that they have vested interests, then that's fine. But that's not what Attitude Magazine purports to be. They purport to be a consumer magazine and a peer-reviewed scientific journal. And I would say that they are actually neither of those things. They are just straight up a trade journal supporting the ADHD industrial complex. All right. So one of the things that happens a lot, though, in Attitude Magazine is that there will be articles that use a lot of rhetorical strategies and bad logic and emotional manipulation. I mean, those are all rhetorical strategies, rather than any sort of evidence or citations to make you feel like you're getting solid information when in fact you're not. All right. So some of the things to be on the lookout for are value-laden language, emotionally manipulative language and stories, and undefined terms and circular reasoning. So for example, there was one article. It was an article by Attitude Magazine, and this is just, what I'm looking at is a screenshot of the tweet that was marketing this article, and it says, "People with emotional hyperarousal have passionate thoughts, reactions, and feelings that are more intense than those of the average person." And then there's a self-test. Could you have emotional hyperarousal? Well, first of all, emotional hyperarousal is just basically repackaged RSD. It's not a real diagnosis. It's not a real medical term. And to equate emotional hyperarousal with passionate thoughts and feelings as though passionate thoughts and feelings are a bad thing is weird. And to then compare ADHD people's emotional hyperarousal to the average person without defining who this mythical average person is, et cetera, just be on the lookout for terms that aren't defined, for, sort of baggage that goes along with the claims that are being made. Another example, this was one of my favorites. The headline says, research shows, that's also something that you should always question. Research shows, or studies confirm, or they say that, with no citations at all, right? Research shows that we have greater challenges with frustration, impatience, anger, and excitability than others do. Which, again, I don't question that. I don't need actually citations for that. I just know that that's true from my own experience and from the vast experience of lots of people with ADHD, right? But then the claim, that's because ADHD impairs our ability to regulate our emotions, to experience them in a controlled way so that they don't gush out into the world. Well, that's a claim, first of all, that ADHD impairs our ability to regulate our emotions. We don't actually know that. That's Dodson's claim right there. But what if it's trauma? Nobody in the ADHD industry wants to look into that, because then they would be implicated. A lot of the trauma comes right from them, right? But even if you look at his description, it's so value-laden. To experience them in a controlled way, as though that is the pinnacle of how to experience emotions in a controlled way so that they don't gush out. These are terms that are value-laden, that betray a set of values about how it's appropriate to be an emotional human being and to experience emotion. And then, if you'd when I digged a little deeper into who was writing this article and what their interests were, it wasn't a medical person at all. And it turned out it was somebody who was trying to sell things, right? So sell, I think, like supplements or something that was going to help you regulate and control your impaired emotions. So anyway, just be on the lookout for anything that's value laden, but purports not to be, or that is sort of emotionally manipulative. Like you shouldn't need to do that to support your claims. And if you're doing that, then I just always want to know why. All right. And then related to that is number 4. Be on the lookout for unacknowledged ideology. And I want to be clear that I mean unacknowledged ideology, because I believe that almost everything is, if not ideological, at least value laden. And I'm not saying that it's wrong for certain experts to come to their research and come to their work and their advocacy and their educational efforts through a set of values, through an ideological lens. Like, it's impossible not to. I mean, that's what I would argue, is that it's impossible not to. But I think that it's important that we acknowledge, that all of these claims, perspectives, paradigms are based in values. I think it's important that we just acknowledge that there isn't any such thing as like pure objectivity and truth with a capital T that's unrelated to context. And then second, I think it's important for us to acknowledge what those are, because that's going to color how I view your claims and your prescriptions and your, your educational efforts and your hacks and strategies and all the rest of it. Like, I want to know what the underlying values are in the paradigm from which you are working. And I think that one of the prime examples of this is Dr. Russell Barkley. And I've written a lot and talked a lot about Dr. Russell Barkley, and I'm sure that I will more. And in fact, I'm not going to go into everything that I have to say about him, because I think that that's actually like a whole live stream, or maybe a whole like more edited, pre-recorded, produced video essay. Like, it needs to be done for sure. I need to do more research on it, because he really is something else. And I do believe that he's done a lot of damage for neurodivergent people. But I just want to cite a couple of examples that have come to light through my own sort of chasing down rabbit holes, chasing down citations, researching, like just digging into and none of it has, I'm not an academic. I'm not trained, especially not in this kind of research. This is mostly just like reading his book, looking at the citations, and then going to Google and seeing like, who is this that he's citing? So 2 things that I want to share with you about Russell Barkley's ideology and why I think it matters. One is that Russell Barkley sort of wrote the book on executive function. He's like really well respected in the field of education and psychology, and certainly the ADHD industry. Shoot, what did I just do? There we go. For having sort of really, like, executive function was a concept before Russell Barkley came along, but he has really kind of consolidated it and given it some real kind of respectability. And so I started to read his book, which I'll put some things in the whatchamacallit, the description below, where I can't off the top of my head remember the names of things, like the book that I'm talking about. I can't remember the name of his book, but it's like sort of like one of the seminal books on executive function. And And I'll be also perfectly honest, I haven't finished reading it. It was like really hard for me to read. Like it's just an enormous emotional slog for me to read this stuff. So I only read the first couple of chapters, but in the first couple of chapters, he's sort of laying the foundation for the rest of his theory. And it turns out, if you follow the citations, that like the whole sort of philosophical foundation of his entire theory of executive function is libertarian ideology. Like literally, he, in a book about supposedly the evolutionary psychology of executive function, he cites 20th century libertarian philosophers and economists as evidence to support the kind of, he doesn't say that these are my values. He just says this is the truth, and here's the sources to support it. And the truth that he offers is that there is no such thing as the common good, and that government has no role to play in the common good because there is no such thing as the common good. Like that is sort of the philosophical foundation of his entire theory of executive function. And if you look at the sources that he cites to support that, you find libertarian philosophers, economists, including some who have, who are like apologists for fascism in the 20th century. Like, I mean, it's just amazing. And again, it's all sort of under the radar. He just like states as a fact, there's no such thing as the common good, footnote, and then goes on to argue a little bit more about it, footnote. And who really goes and reads those footnotes? And then when you get to the footnotes, who actually goes to Google and tracks down that, oh, this guy is a major fascist apologist in the 20th century. Anyway, I do think that you should really track those footnotes down for precisely this reason, because often it will reveal the underlying ideology of the person. And then you can decide yourself, like, maybe executive function is really a thing, or maybe it really is a set of capitalist values masquerading as skills, like Marta says. You can decide for yourself once you understand what the ideological paradigm, the container in which this theorizing is happening. When I sort of like understood Barkley as a libertarian, and by the way, I just want to be clear that I'm not like a knee-jerk anti, like a lot of people will claim, well, you just don't understand libertarianism. You don't know what you're talking about. And the fact is that I actually do have a fairly nuanced understanding of libertarianism, because I've done for lots of my own personal and intellectual reasons. I've done a fair amount of research into libertarianism. I understand it pretty well as a philosophy, if you can call it that. I think it's just like wildly under-theorized and poorly theorized, and I could do a whole live stream on libertarianism, but that would like really be tangential. But anyway, the upshot is that I do actually know a little bit about libertarianism, and I do think that I am in a position to say that doesn't really sit well with me. That's not really okay that he is basing his entire philosophy on this theory of libertarianism. And so I started to do some more research to see if there was, because clearly he doesn't talk about that when he's like giving a PowerPoint presentation to the parents of ADHD kids about ADHD and executive function. He doesn't talk about his politics. But I was just curious if there was stuff out there about it. And two things that I did find were an interview that he gave where somebody asked him, what were the like really formative books that you read as a kid? And I was completely unsurprised to hear that that Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged was like one of the most formative books of his youth. And if you're not familiar with Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged, go Google it. She's pretty awful. But the other thing that I found that was really interesting, and again, I'm not gonna make any grand claims, but it does seem to point in a confirming direction about Russell Barkley's politics. What I found was it was from, I think, November or like late November or early December 2016. So it was right after Donald Trump won the election. And there was a lot of concern about like the integrity of the news and especially with, I mean, this is all continued to this day, but this was sort of the beginning of it, whether social media was spreading misinformation and Facebook, at least sort of like in retrospect, I think that they didn't really take it all that seriously, but they sort of purported to be cracking down on fake news and misinformation and trying to create filters that would prevent the spread of just bald lies and misinformation. And apparently Russell Barkley had a Facebook group that that lots of people participated in and that he participated in really actively at the time. And he decided to like delete his Facebook group in protest. And there was this rant, this just total rant about the socialist Mark Zuckerberg and his like his attack on freedom of speech under the guise of fake news. And it was really kind of amazing. Like it was really ranty and really ideological. And he and it also struck me when I found it that it was right after the election and it was following exactly all of the Trump talking points about like the social media investigation into the spreading of misinformation. So again, I don't know if Russell Barkley is a Trump supporter. And I'm not going to say that he is or isn't because I just don't know. I'd love to have him share with us whether or not he was. But like at the very least, he was very sympathetic to the perspectives and talking points of the Trump administration right after the election around the issue of social media spreading misinformation, which has only obviously become a much bigger issue. So that is my Russell Barkley like endlessly offers illustrations of the need to be on the lookout for unacknowledged ideology. And why does it matter that Russell Barkley may be a libertarian or a Trump supporter? Do I think it's impossible to, I know, right? Socialist Mark Zuckerberg. Is it impossible to be a libertarian and still do good science? Absolutely not. No, absolutely not. But it makes me start to look at the claims that he makes, the value judgments underlying the claims that he makes. And when they really line up really well with his ideology, that makes me start to be a little bit suspicious. But even more to the point is just that they don't line up with my ideology. They don't line up with my values. And so I'm going to take an even more skeptical approach to his work on account of it. So I guess my last point about look out for the unacknowledged values and ideology, I started with it, I'll end with it in this section, is that everybody has values. We all have an ideology or a set of values that is sort of the paradigm or the container in which we do our work. And I do too, absolutely 100%. And if you don't like my values, then you probably won't like my work. And that's fine with me. I'm not trying to convince people to change. I mean, I guess ultimately I would love it if people change some of their values. But at the end of the day, what I really want to do is offer a different perspective to people who largely share my values. Offer them a different way of thinking about these things through the lens of our shared values. And as a consequence, I lead with my values. I'm very upfront about my ideology. And my ideology is just liberation. Like in a word, that's what it's all about. It's about liberation. And it's pretty simple. And if you're not, like, I believe that the work that I do is part of a liberation movement for neurodivergent people, and because it's all connected at the intersections of all sorts of marginalizations for all oppressed people, right? So if you're not down with that, if that's not what you're here for, that's fine. We can just agree to disagree, and you can go on and, go watch Russell Barkley videos. That's great. So the last thing, which is kind of connected to all of these points that I've been making, and which, like I said, Jess is almost always ahead of me, but is just true, is like follow the money. Like figure out what people's financial interests are, because that's part of their values. That's part of their ideology. And I'm not even saying that every single person who has a financial interest in their work is by definition corrupt or can't be trusted. Like I'm not really saying that there's any one marker in any of these things that says, oh, if you see this or if you see that, you should absolutely discard or discredit that person as an expert or their claims. I'm just saying that like it's much more nuanced than that. But I think that we need to learn how to be critical thinkers and make our own determinations. And these are some of the things that I think that you should look to don't be sorry, Jess. It's true. It's just 100% true. That you should be looking to help you decide whether or not you want to dig further, or whether you want to figure out your own position, or you want to find other experts. Like, I just think it's all like critical theory is just super nuanced. It's not like, that's the whole point of critical theory, is that it's not black or white. It's not binary. It's not this or that, So the same is true with follow the money. Like, I'm highly suspicious of so-called experts who get the vast majority of their funding, or who are really entrenched and in bed with the pharmaceutical industry. Do I think that everything that the pharmaceutical industry does is bad? No. I myself have been very happy to take medications that have helped me enormously. I'm glad that they're there. It's not black or white. It's nuanced. It's not binary. It's possible to be critical of the pharmaceutical industry and their influence on the scientific community, and especially the medical scientific community and the ADHD industry. It's possible to be both and I just also want to say at the end that, like, you should follow the money with me too. You should follow the money with everybody. Like, I've had people criticize me on Instagram who say, oh, you criticize capitalists and you say that we should critique them because they have financial interests, and then you ask for money, and then you ask people to support you on Patreon, and then you ask people to join your online community for a fee. And I'm like, yeah, like, I need to make a living, but I'm not exempting myself. Like, if you find those things suspicious, as maybe you should, like, maybe that should give you pause. Maybe you should say, I wonder what Marta's interests in all of this are. What isn't she telling us, or how is she manipulating us with rhetoric? How is she hiding her sources or not citing her sources in the interests of getting us to support her financially? 100%. You should do that. I think that possibly the difference you will find between me and, say, a Russell Barkley or a William Dodson is that, like, if I didn't have a spouse supporting me, I'd be living in poverty. So, like, I'm not doing it very well. I'm hardly making a living at this point. And B, I will be 100% transparent. If you call me out, if you send me an email and say, I found this post of yours really emotionally manipulative, I will investigate that. I will respond to that. I think I said at the very beginning, that anybody who says that you don't have the right to question their claims along all of these points that I have just made, And I'll just recap in a second. Anybody who says that to you, that in and of itself should be a huge red flag. That tells you that there's something there, that there's something under the surface that you should be investigating. All right. So I'm going to go look at some of the comments. And then I'll just recap really quickly. Okay. Chex Mix, love your handle there, says Attitude Magazine, I'm assuming you mean, always makes me look sideways at it. My critical thinking always smells something funky over there. It's interesting to read, but I wouldn't take their articles too literally. Yeah, or too seriously. I think, again, if you understand, like if you come at it with a critical perspective and you understand what they're about, and that what they're about is not necessarily what they claim to be about, then anything that you like, I'm a huge believer, and for the most part, I'm really pretty good at this, at taking what's useful and leaving the rest. Like, there's some specific areas in which I get really emotionally triggered and can't really do that. But for the most part, I'm really good at that. Like, take what's useful and leave the rest. Like, it doesn't, again, it's nuance. Like, Russell Barkley probably has said some things that are really, that I would like completely 100% be on board with. So yeah, it's not either or. So yeah, if you find something's useful or interesting over Attitude Magazine, great. But I think you're right to look sideways at it for sure. I'm gonna. I forgot about that I can do this. But Spiral Nerd says, "Ooh, yeah, I have a hunch my alexithymia is correlated with learning to detach myself from my emotional experience because of the value judgment and reprimand I face for emotions gushing out." Yeah, that term, right? Like, there's something intrinsically bad about gushing out, and we all have certainly been taught that we need to mask that phenomenon. And I'm pretty sure I know that what alexithymia is, and that is the inability to name your emotions, the inability to be quite sure what it is that you're feeling. And I think that is a common thing for neurodivergent people. And as I say with almost all so-called traits or symptoms of neurodivergence, I'm just often skeptical that they are about neurodivergence. I think that, I mean, people have accused me of being a one-trick pony because I see trauma everywhere, but I just do. Like, I think that, like, it's almost impossible to know what it would be like to be a neurodivergent person in a world that was designed for neurodivergent people, in which there wasn't like this constant overlay of trauma, pretty much from like the first time that we took a breath. But yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, Spiral Nerd. And then they go on to say, as if it's better to suppress and control emotions than experience them in authentic, embodied, real-time ways. Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. That's exactly my point. And the notion, like, even just in your comment, the use of the word better, as if it's better, like right there, you can see that we're talking about values, right? Somebody else is saying that it's better to be controlled in your emotions. And we maybe are skeptical about that because we have a different set of values. But whenever you see that sort of value judgment language, whether it's explicit or implicit, that's a key. That's a clue that you should start thinking critically about the claims that are being made. Check Mix laughed out loud at the socialist Mark Zuckerberg. Yeah, same. I'm not sure how to say your handle. I'm sorry. But the comment is, my beef with Attitude Magazine is how their website seems designed specifically to take advantage of my attention issues. Like, how everyone that promises, I'm going to go on to, I think it's all the coaches luring me into their click funnels that I don't follow. Yeah, exactly. Like it really is. I find it, I mean, I'll just be perfectly honest. Like if you find value there, great. I find them just pretty loathsome. And it's not just because they blocked me, but I just find their tactics just like, I find them ableist in like the worst sorts of ways because they purport to be supporting disabled people, and they like are like the moneyed interests involved there, and their unwillingness to take criticism, their inability to like take in new information and think critically themselves is just really awful. Yeah, Jess says shutting down critique and questioning is fundamentally unscientific. Exactly. Exactly. And Jess says, in the International Consensus Statement on ADHD by Barkley and Friends, they compare anyone who questions them to flat earthers. Right. Okay, that's a perfect example. Like that is not a scientific argument. That is an ideological argument. That is such a, like, it's not just a rhetorical strategy. It's just like bad rhetoric. Like it's a bad rhetorical strategy. Like I used to be a professor or an adjunct instructor of rhetoric and comp, right? In the Rhet Comp department of several universities here in Philadelphia, where I taught freshman composition. And if a student of mine, an 18-year-old freshman student of mine, had tried to make an argument by calling the opponents of that argument a name or equating them to something like this, like that just would have been an automatic fail. Like that's just not, like I said, it is a rhetorical strategy, but it's not a respected one. It's not an effective one. It's one that gets you failed in your freshman composition class. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I said that I would recap really quickly, and I'm going to do that really fast. And if you have any other comments that you would like to make in the meantime, please feel free. But I promised you some tips for thinking critically about whether or not you can trust the ADHD experts. And I suggested that probably if you're inclined to be skeptical about the medical model of ADHD or of neurodivergence in general, then I think that a good starting point is to not trust the ADHD experts and to do your own thinking. I think that it's always a good idea to do your own thinking, but I think it's impossible to do it in every area of your life. But if this is an area of your life that you're like really interested in and care about, and want to like figure out how to make it work for you, then I think particularly in terms of the ADHD industry, coming to the claims of any of the so-called experts in that industry with a skeptical attitude is just a good starting point. And I would also say that none of the so-called experts should ever question your right to do that. And if they do, if they're patronizing or dismissive or ridiculing or call you names or compare you to like flat earthers or whatever, then that should be a big red flag that in fact you do need to approach them skeptically. So the five tips that I have to offer are: 1, chase down citations to support claims made by experts. Go read the footnotes and then find the citations themselves. Look at the abstracts, see if the abstracts actually say what the claimant says that they say. If you can't, click on the hyperlinks and do the same. It's not enough that there is a hyperlink. You have to actually read the article on the other end and ask yourself, does this actually support their claim? Or are they just like fooling me? They think I'm a fool and that I'm just going to accept that they link to something, and that must be enough. And then it never hurts to ask. Like, if you've been following this story now for these longer than an hour, on numerous occasions, I have just like, shamelessly written to people and requested information from them. And you can do that. You don't have to be a researcher. You don't have to be an academic. You don't have to be an expert yourself. You're allowed to ask Dr. William Dodson for, for his citations. And what I've come to understand or decide for myself is that I'm not going to try to convince Dodson that he's wrong. I'm not going to try to convince Barkley that he's wrong. I'm not going to try to convince Attitude Magazine that they're wrong. But like, once I get a response from them, then I can I have more information. I have more data to do my own evaluating on. Okay. So that was one. Number two is question deference and claims of two is question deference and claims of authority, like deferring to somebody's authority, deferring to somebody's expertise, to their credentials, to the initials behind their name. That is not the same thing as actual peer review. It's not the same thing as scientific research. It just isn't. So if you see people in a field deferring to one another just merely on the grounds of it's like so circular too, right? Like they're deferring to each other on the grounds of their expertise. Like there's no there. Just don't trust it. That was number two. Number three is to be on the lookout for rhetorical strategies, value-laden language, emotionally manipulative language and narratives, undefined terms and circular reasoning. Just be on the lookout for that stuff, because especially like the sketchy use of it, the manipulative use of it, because if somebody's claims have any merit, they shouldn't need to manipulate you into believing them, right? Number four is be on the lookout for unacknowledged ideology and values. I think it's important that we acknowledge the value that there are values underlying our perspectives and our paradigms and our beliefs and our claims, even scientific ones, like the very questions that we ask are often value laden. So be on the lookout for the fact of it, and then also make sure that somebody's values aren't reprehensible to you, because if they are, then probably like what their values are leading them to, the claims, the perspectives, the solutions are not going to be ones that are going to be good for you in your life. And then finally, always follow the money. Just ask yourself whose financial interests are served here and to what extent. And similar to money is reputation, right? Like if somebody has staked their entire reputation, has built a reputation, this sort of gets back to that credential thing. If somebody's reputation, I suspect that this happened with Dr. Dodson, who, as I said, by all accounts is just a lovely man. But it seems to me that at the end of his work, at the end of his career, which was completely wrapped up now in this concept of rejection sensitive dysphoria, he was not going to say, oh yeah, I was wrong. And certainly not, oh yeah, I was wrong because I was doing really bad, shoddy science. Like it would take somebody a lot of humility to be willing to do that. And then especially when on top of that, there's like a financial component involved. People aren't going to back down. These people aren't going to back down. We're not trying to convince Russell Barkley that he's wrong. We're trying to convince people to look skeptically at the stuff that he says so that maybe they can see that there's another way. All right. I've blathered on a lot. And I'm going to look really quickly. Someone says, oh yeah, I'm currently on a journey through the Amen Clinics industrial complex. I'm not familiar with what that is. The Amen Clinics. I don't know if that's actually a thing or if that's like a sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink reference to something else that I'm not sure of what it is. But yeah, basically anytime that you're dealing with an industrial complex, which just basically means that somebody started out trying to do something good or offer a service, and then it became this like self-perpetuating thing where they had to dig in their heels because they're making money at it, and then it just like blossoms until like the making of the money is the whole point. That's sort of basically the same thing as follow the money, right? Ritika says it's really hard. It's hard to think for ourselves when one comes from a country where this isn't a real thing that exists. So I heavily depend on experts to help me validate myself. Lowest hanging fruit, Attitude magazine. Speaking from India, where basically no support exists, so looking for support critically seems even more uphill. I really do. I really do understand that, and I'm very sympathetic to the position that you're talking about and the perspective you're coming from, Ritika. I don't. I try to make this disclaimer all the time in the work that I do. I'm never criticizing individuals, people who are suffering, and I think it's a process too. Like when I first discovered that I had ADHD, I was a big fan of Dr. Dodson's, and I was really I think I mentioned this at the beginning, really relieved at the concept of RSD. And it wasn't until later when I had more perspective and more support in my own life and had like moved along in the healing process that I started to be more critical about that. And I don't, yeah, I guess I should always, I never quite know how often to make this, this sort of, now I'm losing my words, caveat. But I just want to make it again, which is that I'm never, ever, ever criticizing any individual person's journey or struggle to figure themselves out and find healing and find community. And as I said before, I'm a huge believer in whatever works. Take what works and leave the rest. I'm a huge believer in nuance. Like people always assume because of my critiques of the pharmaceutical industry that I'm anti-medication, but I'm not. I think that if that works for you as an individual person, then that's great. But I also think that I can also critique the pharmaceutical industry. All right. So anyway, I hope that you didn't feel like I was in any way being critical of you personally. And I'm thrilled that you're here. And I'd love for you to seek out. I think that peer support from other neurodivergent people is often the most the most authentic and reliable form of support. I guess I'll leave it at that. And then I have a couple of, so Doc Daniel Amen or Amen. I saw Amen, but and I thought it was like maybe some like Christian something or other. But Dr. Amen, infomercials, brain scan, supplement shop. Yeah. And then Jess says that he made up like 7 types of ADHD with brain scans, right? Yeah. Now I'm I haven't chased that down at all, but I have seen it in my feed in the past. And that's a perfect example, right? Of like follow the money. Like if somebody is purporting to do original scientific research and comes up with, and I think if I remember right, that like the names of the types of these like were really kind of weird and really unscientific. And then he's offering supplements, really expensive supplements to like fix your ADHD brain. That's just a huge red flag for me. The other thing that what I would want to do in the case of Dr. Amen, is write to him and ask him to please offer me the scientific literature about the replicability of his scans. Like in a situation like that, if there really are 7 types of ADHD that can be seen through brain scans, then no matter who is reading the scans, um, you know, as long as they're qualified, like no matter which radiologist is reading the scans, they should be able to see that they should be able to sort them into the 7 categories with like a high degree of replicability. And I'm willing to bet you anything. Like I would, I would bet you a lot of money if you had it. And I'm not even a betting person. So that's just a turn of phrase. But I'm willing to bet you that Dr. Amen cannot offer any kind of evidence that his reading of those scans can be replicated by other radiologists. Yeah. But again, I've only like really, like I didn't even recognize his name. Now that you like mention it, I do recognize that I've seen some of this, and I've seen people in my community who I care about like be scammed by him and like spend shitloads of money on supplements to fix something that just isn't broken. Anyway, yeah. I'll bet you 5 amen brain scans. Absolutely. And Ritika says, thank you. Thank you. Not at all. Really happy at discovering this space. Well, I'm really happy to have you here. And I hope you'll keep coming back and participating in the conversation. I'm going to get going soon. This has gone longer than I usually like to go, but there was a lot of material to cover. And like I think I said at the beginning, I'm already forgetting what I said at the beginning. I really am thinking, or maybe I said this privately to somebody else, but I'm really thinking of this as sort of a first draft or the first iteration of what might turn out to be a series of videos, might turn out to be another or a series of live streams and podcasts where I'd like to bring on some other people to talk to me about these issues. And ultimately, I'd love to see, I would just personally, because I've been sort of down this, especially the Russell Barkley rabbit hole, I'd love to do a whole like sort of feature length video essay about him and his work. But I guess I'll just close, well, 2 things. I'll close just by saying that I think that like every age is an age in which people fail to think critically. So I'm not even going to like make comparisons or say that things are worse right now, but I do think that things are dire right now. Whether they're worse or not, I don't know. But like I think that that there's so much that's wrong in the world right now that is all about our inability to think critically, and I think that comes in part from not being trained to do it. But I also think that there's a large degree of not feeling like we have permission to do it, like feeling like, oh, I'm not an expert. Who am I to question them? Who am I to ask them for their citations? And I just think that is precisely what's wrong with so much of the world right now, and that what we need is more sort of citizen inquiry and citizen advocacy, and especially within our neurodivergent community. You know, the autistic tag, nothing about us without us. Like we need to take that really seriously in the ADHD industry as well. So yes, Marta, Bratek, lots more coming. The live stream is a feature. The live stream is coming at you every week, except occasionally like last week when it was a holiday. And then I'm hoping to turn the live stream into a podcast. And then on top of that, I'm hoping to think about the individual live stream videos that I do as sort of rough drafts for building other things that are also powerful. But thank you very much for that kind comment. And then the last thing, I said there were 2 more things. The last thing is a little plug and for myself, and that is that the Divergent Design Studios community, online community on the Mighty Networks platform is now open for enrollment. It's $20 a month and you get all kinds of amazing things that I'm not going to regale you with now. And if $20 a month is outside of your budget, you can contact me privately and I will work something out with you. But I would love to have you come join us. We have body doubling, we have peer support groups, in general and around specific topics. And what else? Anyway, it's just an amazing community, growing by leaps and bounds. Lots of great sharing of resources and support, all within a sort of critical perspective, but also like a shame-free, really supportive, kind space. So if you'd be interested in joining that, I will try to put a link in the description box below. If you're watching this on the replay and the link doesn't work, that's because enrollment opens and closes periodically, but right now it's open. You can also find the link at my Instagram profile. All right. Thank you all so much. And I hope to see you all again next week. Bye. Oh, last thing. Once this becomes a video, it's really helpful to me if you put comments and if you like it, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel. All right. Bye.